Okay, we've talked in the past already about body language a little bit. So we've talked, like I said, about quite a few of the things that we're going to talk about today, but maybe a little more in depth. Um, so their body language, as we will discuss today, relates both to the interviewer and the interviewee. So in this case, we're going to start talking about the interviewee and his body language or her body language, as the case might be. Um, the interviewer's question or body language effects. So you want to see, you need to watch that the interviewee to see how they respond to your question, um, and your body language in a sense. How do they respond in their face, their body, um, and there are a lot of psychological things that you can study on this. I have not. But it comes pretty naturally. When somebody, you kind of learn as just a human being when somebody's looking, like they're trying to lie to you or something. But there are tells that if you want to study it, that can help you with that if that's if you feel like you need some support with your interviews. Um, so the way it's phrased here is don't be deaf to subtitles of body language. So if you're on the one hand, and this is again another reason why I do frequently use a tape recorder or audio recorder, is so that I can not take as many notes. If you are stuck on taking notes, then you're not able to watch the body language and other aspects of that. For example, we'll come back to it a little bit later, but your eye contact, your body language to the interviewee is almost as important as their body language to you. You're trying to read their body language as to what, are they trying to hide something? Is there something that's disturbed them? Are they, do you, the body language may tell you need to ask a follow-up question. So you're reading their body language at the same time they're reading yours, and you're trying to tell them something that may not be true, by the way. For example, your body language needs to tell them that you're very interested in what they're saying. Even if you're not, you need to act like it, and your body, you need to learn how to control your own body language in order to get them to get that message, so that you can keep them talking. If they think you're bored, then they're going to start climbing up, or they're going to make their questions shorter. They're not going to feel open about talking to you if they think that that it's kind of falling on deaf ears, or that you're skeptical, or that you're whatever they're reading from your face. You don't want to let them read anything negative, or they're going to not give you as good an interview. So you're reading each other's body languages, whether or not you know it. Reading body language is something you do naturally. Just about as naturally as you can, interpret somebody's audio language, their words. We all learn to some degree to read people's body language. And again, even if we don't know that, we do. And so when somebody, again, is maintaining eye contact with you, and if they open their eyes a little bit, that suggests they're interested, or a little puzzled look in their face, or something. You're telling them different things by how your face and your hands and your body overall, your posture. Anyway, we'll get back to the interviewer's body language in a few minutes. But anyway, so a beginner is too tied up with their notes, and even not just a beginner, others too, if they're depending on hand-taken notes. As I told you, even when we're trying our best we very frequently make mistakes in our note taking. So again, another reason why I do use an audio recorder is so that I can go back and check on key parts of that interview. I rarely, unless it's really, really important, I used to transcribe essentially the whole tape. And I realized that doesn't make any sense. And so I learned over time to use my notes as a table of contents, so to speak, for my tape, for my recorder. And so I do want to take enough notes for two things. I take enough notes for in case of a disaster, my recorder's not working properly, or take enough notes that it is like a table of contents, so I can go through my notes and see, okay, that's where I need more. I need to make sure I get exact quotes from this part, because this is the most important part of the interview. So I go back and transcribe that part of the interview. So it doesn't take too long if you have good enough notes that it can act like your table of contents. And if it, if you just transcribe certain pieces of it. So, and again, shifts in body posture, you just kind of see if they're uncomfortable. It usually goes in combo with facial expressions as well. So it's kind of the whole effect. You are looking, again, instinctively, you're looking at facial expressions, you're looking at body posture, and the whole thing, the whole package comes together to tell you how they're responding. So if you want to pay enough attention that you can read their body language, not just the words that they're telling you. So, the appearance, this is the most important for interviewers. So, but it's still the headline up there, understanding interviewees. So you're looking at their appearance, you're looking at their eyes, you're looking at their face, you're looking at their gestures, their head, whether it's straight up and head is part of their posture, it extends from the body, but how, just it comes kind of to me in a package, but we have a few more slides here then to kind of go one by one. So in the appearance, it conveys the most immediate impression. What sort of person is this? Is this a really casual person? Is this a very formal person? Is this somebody who's trying to impress you? That all relates a lot to their appearance. Are they warm and engaging? By the way, that doesn't mean they're honest. So you have to be careful. Just because we think we can read body language, one of the people I can think of that is the most deceptive in body language and so forth is Bill Clinton. I spent a whole hour interviewing him one-on-one. In case you don't know, he was president of the United States in the 1990s, and he's a really good liar. And his body language lies along with his tongue. He's got a lot of flaws as a person, but he's very warm and engaging. But he can use that, not just Bill Clinton. You need to watch out for certain cultures. The Southern culture in America, for example, is warm and engaging. Everybody makes you feel like, it's just part of the culture. They make you feel like you're a friend. But as I know personally, that doesn't keep them from stabbing you in the back. So it's just part of their culture. Whereas, you need to be careful about misreading body language, and it helps if you understand the culture they're coming from. The Southern culture is a very warm culture in America, very friendly, but it can be very superficial. And so, as I said, they can be extremely deceptive behind that superficial, friendly front. On the other hand, people in parts of New York, if they've lived in New York a long time, they can have a very tough exterior. I don't know why that is, why that's part of their culture. But again, it's multiple cultures within the United States. It's a big country. And so people in New York may make you think that they're cold and uninterested and unfriendly, but if you can break through that, they're very friendly, and your odds of being stabbed in the back, literally or figuratively, is probably about the same with both of them. But one of them will do it with a smile, and one of them will do it with a hard-looking face. So you have to be, as you get to understand different cultures, that can help you understand their body language. and other aspects of again, it's not totally body, it also verbal, how they're talking to you. In the South, it can be very friendly, even if they are out to get you. In the North, they can be very unfriendly, even if they have no problem with you at all. So body language is something you have to be careful with. We do grow up with it naturally, but we grow up where? Within our culture, right? So if I grow up in the South, I'm going to interpret things differently than if I grow up in the Northeast, in New York area. And the West, where I grew up, is quite different. It's quite open and honest comparatively. And so it's not overly it's friendly, but not overly friendly. Not trying to put on airs, but it's definitely not cold like in the Northeast in their body language. So the West has its own body language, and that's where I grew up. So I represent that culture, so to speak. So. But nonetheless, you can try with those caveats. You can try to understand them with their appearance. Just like their appearance may tell you something, of course, your appearance can tell them something too. Your appearance can help put things at ease. And so sometimes it depends on the situation. Sometimes you want to dress somewhat formally. Maybe like I am today, and some days you may want to appear more like I dress most of the time with a sports shirt if you're a boy, or something a little more casually. Depends who you're talking to, and whether you feel like they're going to feel like you're too casual if you come in with a sports shirt. So you do have to reflect the circumstances, the position of that person in society, and things like that. And try to, again, that may pertain a lot to understanding their background, doing some research yourself to understand what sort of person this is, so you can dress and act and prepare accordingly. Eyes are extremely important. You need to, let's say this headline here is off, because this is more about what the interviewer does, but it goes both ways. Look at the person you're interviewing, except when taking notes or asking questions. So again, that goes back to the idea that you want to act interested in what they're saying. And, think about if you're talking to a friend, how you normally respond. If they're saying something really interesting, then again, your eyes might open a little wider, kind of suggest, kind of a wow response to it. If they're saying something a little funny, don't be afraid to smile and maybe even chuckle a little bit. It's just, you want to, we've said this before, you want as best you can to establish a short-term friendship with them. And so a lot of that has to do with body language. And if your body language can be, in other words, you're going to play a little bit Southern. If your body language and your verbal language both are friendly, then they can adapt to this idea that you are a friend and be more at ease. So a lot of that has to do, with your appearance, how you dress. Especially, how would I say this? The sports shirt is obviously more casual and more like we're friends, and is something more, this isn't exactly formal, but something more formal, like a shirt and tie. But under some circumstances, that's appropriate. And some people respond better, and they take you more seriously as a professional. It may also depend, how you dress may depend on your age. If you're young, then maybe the shirt and tie is exactly what you do need to wear, for men anyway, and something comparable for women, because you're trying to convince them you're a professional. When you get older, now you can dress down a little bit with the sports shirt, perhaps not a tie, because now you're older, they may already know you from past interactions, but regardless, they assume that if you're older, you're more experienced, you're more professional, you're not trying to put on any airs, you're not trying to prove yourself by dressing up unnecessarily. Again, if you're going to go talk to the President of the United States or a senator or somebody, you probably better err towards being a little more formal. Don't drop your eye when your interviewee looks at you. That suggests that you're not confident. That also suggests, and it goes both ways, by the way, if they drop their eyes when you look at them, that can also be a tell for somebody lying or being deceptive. So you don't want them to think you're being deceptive, but if they drop their eyes when you ask a tough question, then you can question whether they're being deceptive. They don't want to look you straight in the eyes when they're answering your question, your tough question. And so that maybe needs to be a follow-up question or some other effort to see if indeed they are lying to you. So it goes both directions. You want them to perceive you as being very honest, open, interested, and that demands eye contact, and no, shifting the eyes suggests again deception. It can also, depending again, the other aspects, it can suggest approval, even when you disapprove. You can't let them know that you disapprove of what they do. When I was, again, interviewing the mayors who end up being kicked out of office, I definitely could not make them think that I was judging them, or they would have stopped talking about what they were talking about. I have a story. If as soon as they started talking about something unethical or stupid or whatever, I suddenly look judgmental. Suddenly they change their subject totally, quickly, because they're reading me. So I can't let them read me in a negative way. I've got to keep them talking. So as an interviewer, you need to make them think you're interested, you're not judgmental, you're positive, and you look like you're approving even if you're not approving. Because that, again, they will close down if they think they're saying something that is, especially many interviewees are afraid of the press. And so if you come in as a reporter and you look judgmental, then they want to get rid of you as quick as possible. And they're going to watch every word they say. So that's the last thing you can do is show them any signs, body language or verbal language, that you're judging them. You want them open and talking, and as far as they know, they're just talking to their friend. And that's how you need to act. Some people look upwards when they're recalling or constructing an image, downwards when they're recalling feelings or having an internal dialogue. So in other words, those are things that you can look at, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you just understand, if they're looking up and, that's not necessarily bad. But watch out if then they come back with something that makes you think that they were spending that time trying to lie to you, figure out what to say to lie to you. So, you need to follow the sequence of body languages. So yes, it's okay to ponder a second, but it's another thing if then when they come back, there's other signs and the words themselves, their face, how they, their facial impressions, and so forth, whether you can detect if they might be lying to you, and then again may require follow-up interviews with that person, or follow-up questions with that person, or follow-up interviews with somebody else who might know why this person might be lying. So you need to consider those options when you start getting some body language that is telling you this person is having to think too hard. He's trying to guard every word. If he's trying to guard every word, is it because he's afraid of you? And why would he be afraid of you? What's he saying that he thinks he needs to be exactly word perfect? Maybe when he wasn't that way before. So before he was open, but now you ask a question, and now he's trying to make sure he says every word just right. That suggests, obviously, again, from both body language and verbal language, that now he's worried about something. So what's he worried about? Obviously, the face is important. It can register all sorts of emotions: fear, happiness, surprise. Um, you're trying to read their face, and you're trying to not allow them to read anything negative in your face. Again, don't be judgmental. Um, it might be in some cases like one of the I haven't if we have another day off, I might prepare an interview that I had with somebody who did a lot of stories about the mafia in America. So he's talking about how scared he was to go knock on the door of a mafia don, as they call it, a mafia chief. Um, and so he himself was perhaps registering fear in his face because said he definitely felt that way because he was going to go off ask some pretty tough questions of a mafia boss who has the capability of killing you and not even thinking twice about it. Um, so so you need to not let him think that you're afraid, because if you do, if there's somebody that does make you afraid, you can't show that fear, or they will try to take advantage of it. They'll try to intimidate you if they think they can. So that's the last thing you want to do. On the other hand, reading those sorts of these different emotions on somebody's face is important to you. And there can be a combination of these, by the way. Somebody could be surprised at a question you ask. If you've done your homework, or if you've heard rumors about this person, that this person is doing something wrong, then they can be both surprised and fearful at the same time, because you are surprising them with a question they didn't expect, and they are a little bit scared that you are unto them, that your interview is going to be worse than what they expected. Again, certainly watch the changes of expression. You can, after a while, you learn to read a person's body language. I mentioned there's cultural differences in body language. There's also individual differences in body language, and those become particularly distinctive when they suddenly change. So when suddenly their body language, their facial expression, or other body language suddenly changes, now you become alert. Okay, what just happened here? Why that person suddenly, change their posture, and or again looking up, looking down, just shifting, not looking at you, and all these sorts of things all add up to something's going on here. How do I read this combination of body language clues that suddenly happen very quickly? So now you start tying it into the question you just asked, or anything else that you can think of that might have caused them to suddenly change. Watch for, again, the changes of expression. Interested listening to a cold smile, or some real smile, to tighten lips, everything, just the facial expressions. And again, why did they change? What happened that caused them to suddenly become worried, become anxious, whatever. Gestures, hand signals show a variety of meaning. And again, that will change by culture. Hands in a what we call a prayer shape, like this, somehow like a steeple. Hands in a prayer-like position with fingertips together but palms apart show seniority, superiority, confidence. A index finger, wagging is kind of a bowling sort of, and sometimes it gets worse than that. I think I told you one, very powerful person in the city just actually backed me in the corner and started pounding me on the chest. That's pretty obvious. They didn't need a lot of training to understand that body language. He was somebody who thought he had a great authority and that I should be intimidated by him, and that I should do whatever he wanted me to do because he was in charge here. The ticking off points with a finger, is kind of a kind of authoritative sort of thing, but very formal. And you might even suspect a little bit of um, memorization of something if they're ticking things off their fingers. Most of us don't have 5 things all in mind that we can tick off of the fingers as we say them. We have to ponder them a little bit as we're talking about. So somebody, using that sort of a hand gesture suggests they've memorized it. And so you need to, that may be okay, but it also may tell you that they did maybe other, memorizing and practicing to prepare for you when they get that sort of formal. Twirling a pair of spectacles, glasses, around and round means the same as possibly as we were just talking about. With the oops, where are we here? Going backwards. I'm going the wrong direction. That's the problem. Okay, so again, kind of like ticking things off, somewhat authoritarian, but not always. My experience, contrary to the instructor that made this PowerPoint, that's kind of like looking up to me. They're kind of trying to think things through a little bit, which not necessarily a bad thing, but they're pondering a little bit. And you do have to ask yourself, what are they pondering about if they do that? That's the way I would read that body language. But again, different places, different cultures that may mean something different. If they're kind of distracted and they're pushing something around the table or something, it again is they're dismissing or rejecting what is a hard question or something like that. Again, that suggests they're kind of thinking about it and trying to kind of stall a little bit in that question, which again, twirling the glasses, some other things might suggest that also. A hand near the mouth can mean anxiety or deception. I think it's a little bit hard to read any one thing. That's again what I say. You kind of have to read all the body language at once. So gestures and eye contact and facial expressions, you kind of have to read them in combo to understand exactly what somebody's what you should make out of somebody's body language. Again, you can read these kind of some of the same things, things that are put into the mouth. They're suggesting here is reassurance or aggression. That's kind of opposite to me. But it's again reading in combo with other body language. Hands near the chin is very frequently, something about giving some extra thought. Rubbing the back of the neck is again kind of frustration, or feels like you're kind of backing them into a corner sometimes, possibly. Position of the palm, a palm up is typically a little more open, is what that usually says. If they're closing their hand somewhat, that suggests a little bit closed by actually the hand gesture represents what it might tell you. Again, another hand stroking the neck or the mouth, touching movements, kind of suggest the pacifiers, trying to calm oneself down. Arms, again, crossed, they're kind of defensive. Open is welcome. Tightly crossed legs, nervous, insecurity, lack of cooperation. feet tap or a twitch. Interviewee is not comfortable. Nods and head tilts, encouragement and approval. Forward, it can be a little bit aggressive, higher, a little more superiority, kind of dominating, and whether you're dropping, then can be more of a submission sort of a sign. Again, you need to take these things in combo. The more they're looking forward and towards you, the more you can feel that they're feeling like it's going well. By the way, flip the switch, same to you. And so that's why we want to maintain the eye contact and maintain good posture and look them in the eyes with confidence and as warmly and as positively as possible, no matter what they say. So that, again, you're trying to hide your feelings and you're trying to detect their feelings. So it's kind of a game. Again, leaning away or backwards, very relaxed or perhaps lost of interest, so that is also important to understand if basically you're boring them. So as I mentioned, body language is both received and sent. And so, we're trying to understand them and we're trying not to get any negative clues from our body language or from our verbal language. We're trying to be as positive as possible, but no matter what they say. If they say they murdered their mother, oh, really? I'm kind of exaggerating a little bit, but you want to be as positive as you can, no matter what they talk about, because they'll keep talking then. You show them disapproval, then they'll start closing down. And again, there's if you lean forward a little bit, kind of suggest, yeah, I'm really interested about this. Whereas you go backwards, I'm kind of bored. So how you lean, you're nodding, you're listening and kind of maybe agreeing or you're understanding as you're nodding. So again, more body language you can use and that you can understand. It says here, in some cases, you need to interrupt or whatever. You lean forward and raise your hand a little bit, and so especially if they're very talkative, you're almost saying, yeah. I mean, you don't have to be so obvious as to act like a student, but that kind of sign does tell them that you want to ask a question. So it doesn't have to be like that, but they kind of get the idea if you kind of raise your hand a little bit and lean forward and. Anyway, it's a way of telling them that you would like to ask a question in the middle of their answer. And again, some fast nods or slow nods. They're saying that 3 seems to be a good sign to tell them, okay, keep going. Another follow-up question, though, verbally can do the same thing. You've interrupted them, and now maybe it's a good time to ask a follow-up question that will get them back on track again. So it mentions here if they're talking too much, then you may want to cut back on the nods, lean back a little bit because you want to tell them a little bit with body language without insulting them that now you're getting a little bit bored, and so you can use your body to help get them to kind of slow down. But you may have to do the interrupt sign more often also. And so, if you're running out of time and they're talking too much, then, just plan to interrupt them a little more often. And a little hand signal and asking, in that case, you might want to ask a somewhat different question. They've already given you a lot of information. They've already given you the information you need in response to your last question. So now you want to get them off to a different question. And so, once you interrupt, now try to steer them differently if they're talking too much. If you suspect they're telling lies, it suggests cover your mouth or flick, or you do basically what they would do, is flicking a, imaginary fluff from your jacket or something. Look away for a second, but sometimes you don't want them to know that they're lying, or you think they're lying. Because again, if you show them that you think that they're lying, then they're going to stop lying. Now you do have to circle back around. And I mentioned the Joe Treaster, the New York Times reporter, who would let them tell their lie, and then he would have done enough background, enough preparation that he could say, if you recall, so the first question is kind of general. The subject he was talking about was the labor leader using union funds for himself. And so, you might just start very general. You're being accused of using union funds for yourself. And so he lies to you. And then you say, well, now there's a couple of very specific things that they've suggested are indicative of your use of union funds inappropriately, like your trip to Thailand last year. And then now they're trapped a little bit, so they follow up and they might try lying again, and then you follow up with, yeah, well, I can understand what you're saying, but you're the treasurer of the union is saying he has receipts for you and for your secretary in Thailand. That seems very unusual. What you're doing in Thailand, and why was your secretary with you, so forth. So you just kind of, with questions, pins them backwards, or backs them into a corner, you might say. But at the time when he's lying with the first question, you just let him lie. That's okay, because now you can back them. He gets the lying out of himself out a little bit, and he thinks, oh boy, he's believing me. And now you ask the next question, and now he's getting backed into the corner a little bit. So be a little bit careful, even if it's body language that you think the person's lying, because do you want him to know you think he's lying? Is there a strategic purpose in letting him know you're lying? And is there a better way of handling it? Let him lie and then follow up. Do you have other information that can push him into the corner, like Treaster was talking about? Anyway, sit comfortably, avoid legs tightly twisted, crossed, or clamped, or whatever. Just be comfortable. And again, your whole reaction normally should just be like a friend, just comfortable, having a nice chat with a friend. Well, obviously, there are some clues for when somebody is lying. Again, the verbal and vocal clues, evasion, avoidance of the truth. That you ask a question, they answer a different question. That, by the way, in PR, you're taught to do that. If you're a political figure and somebody asks you a really tough question, then you may act like you're answering the question, but then you very quickly veer off and answer a different question. And so they're trained in PR to, in fact, when I've taught PR in the past, I've required all my students to go through a personal interview on the part of myself and other students to make them feel how, on a subject where there'd be some controversy and stuff, so we could try to pin them back in the corner if they answered poorly or whatever, to get that feeling of what's it like as a person being interviewed, because sometimes you're put in a position as a PR person, or if you have to train your CEO, in the case that he's going to be asked some really tough questions, how not to answer questions. And not act like you're not answering. Not that you're not refusing to answer questions. You're just veering off and answering a different question. Basically, you're prepared with a different answer, and so you have some answers ready to go, And if you don't like a question, oh yeah, that's a good question. Off you go. And now it's their problem to try to pin you back in the corner. So again, that becomes a game. So PR people need to learn those sorts of tactics, and good people that are deceptive, that are good at it, will use those tactics on you. So you need to understand that. And again, you might be able to detect that they are, whether they're going off to a different answer. You have to bring them back, ask that question again in a different way perhaps, but bring them back to the subject. And in some cases, you may have to call them on it. Say, you're not really answering my question. And what I'm really trying to get to is this. And try not to let them out of that corner. Anything that they say, it has some things in quotes there. I can't tell you that. That's all I know. Well, if that's, those are things they say when they know more. Let me put it that way. And so just because they say, that's all I know, it's probably a lie. I can't remember. I've been following a lot of this stuff between the Republicans and Democrats in America. And basically, all the people who, like people who are FBI, the former head of the FBI, he can't remember anything. You get in front of him and you put him under oath, he can't remember a thing. He has been the stupidest person in the world. He can't remember anything. And because how do you prove that somebody can't remember something, or that they can remember something? So people that are good at it, they can't remember anything. I don't know. I don't really recall that. And so they're lying at some point, especially if they do use that a lot. And if their position is such they had to know, then it doesn't take too long before you realize this person's just outright not going to answer the question, or he's got to do everything he can to not answer the question. Again, perhaps with some backup information, you can try to pry it out of him, out of that person. Again, it mentions, again, it's not really body language, but if they speak a lot more loudly, that suggests that they're trying to force you to accept their answer, their response. And so they're trying to be a little more dominating, and force you to accept what they're saying. If they, again, just subtle things, they suddenly slow up. Again, their attitude, their emotions, their body language. You're trying to read all of this at once to figure out if somebody's lying. And then you have to adapt to that, ask more questions, apply some information you already have. As the example I was giving you with Treaster, you start revealing a little bit more that you know, and so that it's harder and harder for them to lie about it. So, to avoid problems in the interview, one of the first things you need to do is be well prepared. Again, using Treaster as the example, if you have information and somebody is trying to lie to you or trying to say they don't remember something, and you have enough information that you can, call them on it a little bit, and you don't call them an outright liar, but you can be as forthright in some cases once you get to that point. And remember again, one of the videos that I'm asking you to listen to for last week's holiday, again goes through, this was with the Fleeth is his name, a Pulitzer Prize winner from Oregon in America. But he's one of those, and some others suggested too, that you start with the easy questions, build to the tough questions, and then kind of go to some easier questions at the end. So when you start, calling somebody's bluff and saying they're lying, then that should be towards the end of your discussion, if possible, because they could just shut you off altogether if they don't like your attitude. So you need to be prepared, and you can kind of back them up like Treaster did. But don't do it too soon. Again, you might lose your interview if you do it too soon. So there are times I mentioned some of the suggestions by the Village Voice editor, who said sometimes he starts right off with a tough question. You have to be real careful with that. That's not the norm in reporting. Usually go start with the easy questions and build up to it, because again, if you scare them too much, or if you make them too anxious or make them angry, then you don't have an interview at all. So that would be a strategy that would be fairly seldom used. It might be, for example, you see it sometimes in a press conference. I mentioned the other day, in a press conference, you might only have one question. So, and the person's there and standing in front of 20 reporters, they can't very well walk. He could walk off, but not, that's a story by itself. If the interviewee is in a press conference and he gets mad at your question and walks out, that's a story right there. But it's unlikely he's going to do that. So you have one question to ask. There's too many reporters to expect to ask two questions or something. You need to ask your tough question right off the bat. So frequently when you see reporters in the White House asking questions, not necessarily of the president always, but his spokesperson, they might start off with the background information. So they may say, well, now you guys said that, it's a crisis at the border, but these other people say it's not a crisis, it's no big deal. Who's telling the truth here? We need to understand what's going on. So you go ahead and that's your question. You give a little bit of, kind of back in the corner a little bit. These other people are saying you're lying. What are we to believe here? And let them bring out some facts if they can to defend themselves. It says, don't be in a hurry. Tell them what time you have. So if you have a time limit, and that becomes more likely, not only, but more likely if you're a broadcast or a video reporter, that you have some deadline that you need to hit the evening news at a certain time. But print reporters do too. But a lot of the print reporting is done in the morning, even for a story that's going to come out in the next day's paper. So you have a little more. You're not as tied to events. Too many. A lot of the broadcast reporters get tied to events, and those events are usually events that are to accommodate the most people. And that's usually not the morning. It can be, but it's usually not. It's usually maybe noontime, maybe maybe in the early evening. So that kind of ties the hands of a lot of the broadcast reporters, that whereas the newspaper reporters aren't quite as strict in their timeline, but they might be too. They might be facing a deadline as well. So you can tell them even up front, even before you even start your interview, how much time you have, and so they can kind of pace themselves. Of course, they could use that against you. If they know you have 30 minutes and they don't want to tell you the truth, then all they have to do is keep talking and force you to try to stop them and try to bring them back on track. And they start telling their stories, and pretty soon you're out of your 30 minutes and you haven't learned anything that you wanted to learn. So telling them what time you have, at some point you may have to, and it depends on the person and how difficult the interview might be, whether you feel like you have to tell them how much time you have. But try not to be in a hurry and not to portray yourself as in a hurry if you can. You can't always. It says don't talk about yourself. I say that with the caveat that the editor from the Village Voice says there are times when you want to talk about yourself. Now, he did a lot of, as I mentioned, in his case, he was actually maybe living with the rock band for a month. So he was not nearly, and he works for a magazine. So, a magazine style newspaper anyway. And so he might feel that he has more time. And so he doesn't care if it takes him a whole day or longer. So in that case, he used it strategically. I mentioned his example that he gave about, telling the embarrassing story of how he lost his virginity, hoping that the rock star would reciprocate and tell him his embarrassing story, which would, only his would appear in this story, of course, not the reporter's. So again, don't offer negative judgment. Be careful in your questions. Sometimes going back to the press conference, again, because they know they only have one question, they really ask two questions. In order to ask two questions, their questions become very convoluted, and it's hard for the person talking to even remember what they asked after a while. And so very frequently they answer the last question and they stop, or if they really want to answer, if they feel like they have the time, they may ask you to ask that question again, because you've asked two questions, not one. And that's kind of confusing to them. Some things that can go wrong, don't let them take control. In which case they tell you what they want to know, what they want you to know, not what you want to find out. That's not just that, but other situations where, as again, the bank president backing me in the corner and pounding me on the chest, he definitely wanted to take control. He wanted me to succumb to his superiority. And actually, I probably handled that very poorly. I mentioned, I think before, I probably should have offered to let him basically write another story and hear him out, is what I should have done. I reacted poorly because he had me in the corner pounding me on the chest. I was insulted myself, and I reacted not in the best way. I could have maybe diffused that situation a lot better if I had been a little bit. I could still say I really did give you plenty of opportunity to answer my questions. I understand that you might have been reluctant. Maybe you were a little bit afraid. You don't know me. Let's kind of start all over again. I would love to do another story based on your experience with this guy who, says everybody's out to get him, basically. And so you get him talking, and then you get back to the question. His brother-in-law was the one that told me that your car blew up when you went in to serve papers to this orchardist. And so, I could have had a great second story instead of being offended that he was pounding me on the chest and trying to exert his control over me. I could have turned that to my advantage, but I didn't. So I was young. Understand what makes a great story, your angle, and what information you need. Again, that's kind of what I was saying about understanding. You need the bricks and mortars. You need all the bricks. You need those quotes. If it's a video interview, obviously that's a little bit different. But in video, you're looking for just the right word, something short and concise that tells the story. So you're looking for something a little bit different, and you may have to ask them different questions to get them to consolidate. They've been talking for 10 minutes about something, and you want that in one soundbite. You want a 10-second version of the 10-minute interview. You want the soundbite. And so in video, you're always going for soundbites because you're very pressed for time. Again, if you listen to I think the last holiday, Jim Polk talking about that 2,000-pound pencil that he had to learn how to wield. He was a print Pulitzer Prize winner for print, and then he went to work, I think it's for NBC, whatever national network it was, and he had to become used to that. And that's where he was talking about having literally, having a couple hundred, what do you say? More than 100 hours of video for a 4-minute story. That's the hard part with video, is gathering everything you want, but now having to cut it down to 4 minutes or whatever the director allows you to have. So it's a whole different problem with the video than it is with a newspaper. But because somebody can string you along, and again, you're trying to find that perfect soundbite, because that's in essence what the editor with your assistants as a reporter is going to be doing, is going through that long interview and trying to cut that. Maybe it's not what Polk was talking about. It's not 100 hours of video down to four minutes, but it may be it could be 30 minutes of interview, and you have to cut it down to 2 minutes. So now that's again where we're talking about sound bites. You need to find just the right sound and edit just that little piece out. And so the questions you're asking, how you ask the questions, how you might follow up. Now these talk 10 minutes. Now how do you get them to shorten that up into something that will make a sound bite? Loop and circle. Kind of what I've been talking about a little bit with people who are trying to lie to you and stuff. Counterploy, returning to points you want clarified, questions you want answered, and a challenge for things if you think they're lying about. So you might let them go for a while and then come back, circle back around to the tough questions you need to ask later on in the interview to avoid them cutting you off altogether. You can bore them. So make sure you have good questions, a fresh twist. Don't ask them the same questions. I mean, you might have to confirm some of the information, but especially if other people have been interviewing them, you want to find a fresh angle to make it not just for your station, which is important, or for your medium. You want something new, not just regurgitate what somebody else has already been covering. So you want a fresh angle, but also you also don't want your interviewee to be bored. And so you want some fresh questions for him that other people haven't asked. So be prepared with good questions. You can also misunderstand somebody, mishear them. Now that usually clarifies itself in the context, but if it doesn't, then you need to go back and ask that question again. I remember one of the people I interviewed for one of my academic stories, actually wasn't an interview, it was an open-ended survey question. He was talking about how he hates it when he hires young reporters, and at most universities they don't teach reporters about local government, and yet that's where most reporters start. It was a local newspaper. They don't start with the big city newspaper, and so they come to the small town, and now you're sending them out to city council, and they're talking about things that like the sewage problem, or some sort of a construction problem with that they're having building the new city hall or whatever. And you can get into the example he gave was that it was an engineering term. I forget what it was now, but it's an engineering term, and the young reporter misheard it, was not familiar with that engineering term, and put a quote in the newspaper that was absurd, because he misheard and didn't ask for clarification, and so it came out really stupid, and displayed his ignorance that he didn't understand this engineering term, and again was an indictment of the universities who insist on requiring them to take courses in national and from the federal government and national issues, when that's not where they're going to start. They're going to start at a local newspaper, and they need to understand sewer issues and how local governments are established, how they're run, what sort of problems they're talking about. And most universities in America fail to do that, which is what made this editor exasperated with the quality of young reporters he's getting out of universities. They don't know anything about local government. They can tell you all about Washington, D.C., but they don't know anything about the local government, how it works, what sort of problems they face, and that's a problem. So trying to bone up, if you get a job with a local newspaper, you need to understand the sort of stories you're going to be writing are going to be different than maybe they had you writing at the university, because the professors are more interested in international and national news, and they're not interested in the sewer problems of the local town. but that's exactly what you're going to be writing about. And so you need to bone up on that. If you haven't taken courses to help you understand those problems, then you need to maybe do some pre-interviews. Uh, Go just spend some time going around. Maybe you go like I did with the mayor, that I ended up getting kicked out of office, but have him take you around and show you stuff and talk to you about stuff and ask stupid questions if you need to, so that when you start writing a story, and you may still get a story out of that, but you're spending maybe several hours with him to write a story, and you have time, you're not in front of other people, you can ask stupid questions if you have to. Because that's how you're going to have to learn if they're not teaching you at a university. So don't be afraid to ask them to explain. What do you say about again, he had a really good example of how somebody misheard something. He came up with something really stupid for the newspaper, just by mishearing some engineering term, but I can't remember what it was. Again, some interviewees are what they call wafflers here. They talk too much. They don't really say much. You need to understand how to try to pin them down. You need to be more specific in your questions. And if they're using that as a tactic to avoid answering the tough questions, then again, you need to come circle back around and be very specific. And if necessary, if they're trying to do that on purpose, you're pretty sure they're trying to do that on purpose, you need to tell them that. Perhaps we really, you're kind of being very vague about this. I just really need, can't you just answer this question straight out? Because I don't understand why this money disappeared from the union fund. And so they have a quote here that you might say, what you say is amazing. I could listen all day, but I have to move on. What about, so they're trying to get on to something, a more specific question. That'd be one way of doing it. Again, they already talked about how you kind of use your hand to ask them to let you ask another question, and just go to, you don't necessarily have to confront them verbally. You can do that again just with a gesture and interrupt. So again, some people just evade, they slide off the subject with ease. As I mentioned, sort of response is fascinating, but what I really want to know is, wow, really, but first let's get back to this other subject. That's a great story. I'd like to know much more, but first I'd like to clear up this. All those three questions suggest that you might be too kind, and you might be causing. All of these start off really positively. That's a great story. Wow, really fascinating. I wouldn't always necessarily be that accommodating to somebody I think who's lying to me. But I would interrupt and ask the more specific question, and not apologetically try to steer them back with another question. And again, if necessary, suggest that they're, getting off topic on purpose if necessary. An interviewee might be hostile, might be a bully, might be aggressive. It says if you lose your temper, you lose the interview. So you need to be careful about that. And usually being, again, the Treaster method with the union, it's still, thinking back, still is fascinating that he gets Christmas cards from this guy that he helped put in prison, but he did it just so smoothly, apologetically. I have to ask this question. The documents suggest you were there for yourself, and and there's other people who say that you're having an affair with your secretary, that this was just a junket. You're spending that money to go to Thailand for yourself and for, to have a good time with this lady. There's some documents here that suggest very strongly that you've made a lot of trips with your lady friend that you call secretary. I mean, that's what they're saying. whatever. So you can be a kind of apologetic in some cases, not always, but at the same time, don't let them bully you out of asking the tough questions by any means. Um, but you don't necessarily have to. You don't need to lose your temper. I've never lost my temper ever as a journalist. Um, Again, another way of phrasing it, what you just said didn't answer the question, in my opinion. So I'll ask it again and hope this time you'll provide a more relevant answer. So this would be more direct. As I mentioned, in the previous page, it was kind of almost too friendly. Especially if you think that they're trying to manipulate you, you need to be a little more direct sometimes, without being offensive, without being angry, but just being to the point. Um, and that might come later in the interview when when you've gotten everything you could without being more stern with them, but you're now approaching the end of the interview and you need to ask the toughest questions. This is from both sides. Try not to ask questions to which they can answer yes, no, can't say, don't know. Make sure, again, asking open-ended questions. If you say, how did you feel? They can't say yes, no, whatever. They have to answer that in a longer form. So the way you phrase a question is very, very critical. If you want to, again, you might think out the questions ahead of time. You don't necessarily go down the list, but you might still think about them ahead of time and think of them in the format of a how and why, open-ended questions that can't be answered with a yes or no. Again, the approach, fairly precise questions, even if they are calling for detailed, tell me exactly what happened. Again, those are more or less why or how questions, just phrased a little bit differently. How to get the interview to start with. One is be enthusiastic, be positive. Even if you think it might turn into a tough interview, you want to be as unthreatening as possible. The more you act like you're the enemy, the less likely you're going to get the interview. And so kind of 1 and 3 are more or less the same. Enthusiastic, optimistic, positive. Number 2, be persistent. It's kind of like being a salesperson. Both of them, actually, both of these are like being a salesperson. You're trying to sell yourself to get that interview. And so these are all things that a salesperson would do. A salesperson has to act very positive, very enthusiastic, very optimistic, very excited about their product or whatever. And you're more or less being a salesperson to get that into that interview. But you may have to call back a number of times to get it, or you may have to show up in their office or whatever you have to do to try to get that interview if they're trying to avoid you. And the more persistent you are, again, I mean, you can combine them. You can be persistent and optimistic and positive at the same time. So again, that's where you might have to control your temper a little bit because you're exasperated with them. You've tried to go through the secretary, and the secretary says she'll get back to you, and she does not get back to you. You're in the sense of persistence, you show up at the office, and you are very willing. It's a day when you don't have a real heavy schedule, and you just sit down and say, "I'll wait for him. That's fine." Oh, he's going to be busy for the next couple of hours. That's okay. I'll just stay. That's fine. And just just plant some roots into his office until he comes out. But you can do that and still be optimistic. You don't have to be negative about it. Oh, I so much want to talk to him. I'll just wait for him. I've got some time today. I've got some things I can work on my phone and stuff. Try to be positive but persistent. And I suggest you might go through somebody else, somebody who's knows you, for example. If you think they might be afraid to talk to you because they're afraid to have a bad story come out, well, then maybe somebody else can help be the intermediary. And that could be a PR person. It could just be a friend. I mean, it's hard to know. Who do you have? Who can you contact to be your intermediary? Who to help set it up? Certainly, if they have a PR person or somebody who kind of acts like it. Many times in smaller organizations, the secretary acts as the PR person, and so or there's somebody like that. Many women get into PR starting off as a secretary, but they're good enough in human relations and stuff, they end up being in PR and start making a lot more money when they work their way into PR. Especially if it's a smaller organization, they don't have, if you ask, well, who's in charge of your public relations? And they say, oh, we don't have anybody, then very well could be the person you're talking to, the secretary. And so you might have to treat her like the PR person. And uh, be enthusiastic and positive and try to get her support in getting in to talk to the boss. You might write a letter or an email, and these days explaining what you want. Again, if they're afraid of you, if you can kind of give them, set the end in mind. What is it we're trying to accomplish here? Why it's to their benefit? That may help a lot. Number 6 there, call to verify information obtained by other sources. By the way, you can lie. Again, that's your job to get information. And so the reporter I was talking about that would sometimes do stories about the mafia, he would get, at first they would start to close the door on him in some cases, for example, and he'd say, well, this, we have this source that says that you da-da-da, and you just lie about what they said. And so it's so negative, though, that even if they're a mafia boss, they say, that's not true, whatever. And so you can actually put them, get them to where they feel like they have to talk to you because you have the false information. And so that particular reporter says he does that all the time on purpose. He just says, just make something up. I heard thus and thus, and the person has to talk to you then because it's so bad what you've been told supposedly, which you just made up, that they feel like they have to clarify it. So it's kind of anyway, it's a sneaky way to get somebody to talk to you. But this is suggesting you do it with truly, true information. And of course, if you have true information, that works too. But like I said, the mafia reporter did it with false information. So, and that probably even in some ways worked better because it was information that he just made up that was bad enough that somebody felt absolutely compelled they had to straighten you out. And so even a mafia don, come on in, I have to tell, no, that's just not true. Come here, let me explain it to you. And so suddenly gets in to talk to the big cheese of the mafia because he wants to set him straight, when in reality he didn't have anything at all. He just made something up. Seek opportunities to meet the source informally after a press conference or a public speech. There's other ways to, again, enlist the interest of aides. Again, so you look at whoever that knows them. It might be somebody internal, but it might also be somebody external that you might be seeking help to get you in to talk to somebody. Offering to drive somebody, who's really busy to the airport or someplace, or to their next appointment. If they have to go someplace, maybe I can just jump in the car with you and we can talk on the way. Maybe it's their car, not your car. You could offer your car. That happened one time to me. I'd forgotten about this. I had bought a really junky car. It was terrible. It was ridiculous. But if you imagine the worst car you've ever seen, that was my car. I had moved from the West Coast to the East Coast. We sold everything. We had a nice car on the West Coast. We sold everything, moved to New York, and then we moved from New York down to Arkansas. And in Arkansas, I went someplace where there was a U.S. senator, and so I wanted to interview him. In this case, it was his idea. Well, let me just jump in the car and you can drive me into town and I'll tell you all about it. And I had this such a junky car. It was so embarrassing. But I got a good interview, but I was very uncomfortable as a reporter. Maybe he felt sorry for me. You poor guy, you are so broke. You can only afford a car like this. It was, like I said, you imagine a bad car, partly because in those days, I'd been living in Buffalo. Buffalo gets over 100 inches of snow every year on average. So they have to do something about the snow, right? So in those days, they were just using salt. And salt corrodes metal. And so you're driving a car in Buffalo, New York, if you're not doing something extraordinary, suddenly the bottom of your car is going to start eroding. And so this was an older car, and you could literally see through the floorboards under the street because all the salt from the melting the snow in Buffalo. And so then I moved to Arkansas, where nobody had that problem. So my car, like I said, was by far the worst car I'm sure you'd ever been in, because you could actually see the see the road through the holes. Ridiculous. Anyway, he must have felt sorry for me. I got to get an interview from him. Yeah, you can find some way to talk to somebody who's busy, especially if you think that's really what that is why they're hard to get a hold of. They're just so busy. Then you can accommodate them in some way. Another opportunity, if they have to eat dinner sometime, so invite them to dinner. How about a quick dinner? We can go someplace, whatever, and I can interview you by dinner. I presume you eat, don't you? Focus your interview on a topic the source will enjoy discussing. Use flattery. What's the thing people enjoy discussing most themselves? So you might ask them more kind of personal questions, the things that they might like to answer. Flattery, as I said, is just say positive things about them. I noticed you were in the newspaper the other day, and wow, you really, or in the TV, it might be better. You really gave a good interview for the TV reporter. Just right on. Explain the options to reluctant sources involved in public crisis. For example, they don't want to talk to you because they're afraid they might say something that will get them in trouble. There's several options with that. They need to understand, like this banker, maybe I should have explained to him also. He hung up on me, so I probably didn't have a chance. But anyway, sometimes when they're reluctant, you just have to explain, my option is I have to write that you refuse to comment. You understand that? Because I have to let my readers know that I tried to talk to you. And so, do you want to give a comment that makes some sense, or do you want them to think that you're afraid to talk to the press? It's up to you, but you need to understand either you answer some questions or I have to put in. It's my obligation as a journalist to let my readers know that I tried to talk to you. And so I have to put that in the story. I would be more comfortable, and I think you would be better off answering a few questions and so that I can tell them what your situation is and not say that you were afraid to talk to me, in essence. I wouldn't phrase it that way, but that's the way they might interpret it, that you were afraid to talk to me. You don't want them thinking that you're afraid of the press and that you have something to hide. And so I don't want you to feel that way. So let's just have a short interview here, and it'll be fine. You don't need to worry about it. Again, there are sensitive and embarrassing questions or critical questions related to business or public affairs or the family in some cases. Dealing with traumatic events in one's life, those are tough. With embarrassing questions, avoid arguments, angry accusations, anything like that. And again, the example of Joe Treaster from the New York Times, just be as, I'm really sorry to have, this will work for somebody who's trying to hide something, but it also works for somebody who's gone through a tragedy. So you feel like you need to go talk to the family of somebody who was murdered or something. I am so sorry to bother you, but we're running a story on this, and I thought you might want to talk a little bit about your son and your feelings. I just can't even imagine what you're going through. right now with your son, being shot down in broad daylight, and I'm so sorry. But I thought it'd be nice if you could maybe tell us um, well, some of the positive things, the things the special events that you remember in his life, his positive attributes, um, and so maybe start them in the positive side, and then maybe go to a more negative question. How do you feel about all the gangs and stuff running around here? What do we do about it? What do you think? So you try to be as empathetic as possible, and even then, sometimes you can't get that interview, but it's going to be more likely if you're feeling empathetic or if you're acting empathetic with them. And I mean, you can be empathetic. You don't have to pretend if it's not something. I mean, in some cases, you have to pretend if it's, for example, the union boss who misspent union funds, then you have to pretend to be empathetic because he's a thief. But with the parents of somebody who got killed, well, now you don't have to pretend. You can be truly empathetic. So again, personal questions, have a good reason for asking, explain that others will benefit, educate the public, things like that. Avoid pressure tactics, let people know what they or let them tell what they want to tell you. Again, the case of a murdered child or something, let them get going, and then you can redirect towards the end of that interview after they've had a chance to kind of share their emotions, their positive feelings about their son who was killed by a gang or whatever, and then maybe towards the end steer it towards, you've got to be really angry that this would happen. It's so exasperating that we have these gangs so active in our city. What do we do about it? And then maybe was this gang mad at your son for some reason? Why did they shoot him? Um, was he drawn into a different gang or something? What was going on? And so you ask the easy questions. Now they're feeling more talkative, and they can maybe answer the tough questions that you wouldn't want to start with. So they'll clam up. If you're going to ask about their gang affiliation right off the bat, you've lost your interview. But if you get them talking about what they liked about their son and what his good characteristics were, and then empathetically, then get them talking about the gang problem, and then even give them a chance to kind of make an excuse for their son for being part of the gang. A lot of young people are drawn into gangs kind of for self-protection. Did your son get drawn into a gang? Is that why they shot him? Why a rival gang shot him or whatever? So you give them a little bit of an excuse, for example, for why their son was the way he was. And again, as you listen to them, you can kind of, again, you can articulate your feelings and try to, again, show your empathy. Accuracy, neglecting minor details results in inaccuracy. Names misspelled, names misspelled, titles wrong, points misunderstood. You need to be really sure you get that stuff. If there's any question whatsoever, if you don't know absolutely how to spell their name, you need to have them spell it for you. What their position is. They're at a university, for example. There's a different. I mean, the ranks go from typically from a lecturer, senior lecturer, assistant professor, associate professor, full professor. That may not mean anything to you. They're all a professor to you, but it may mean something to the person you interview, and it does. It definitely makes it. If you say something that in any way diminishes them, it can be definitely a problem. But even there frankly aren't a lot of full professors on campus, and it's a very esteemed position. I don't personally take it that seriously myself, but some people do. In fact, even my colleagues tell me, Ken, you're a full professor. You have to have people call you professor, and you can really take advantage of your position. And I kind of, yeah, whatever, But some people, it really is important to them what their actual title is, and so on a campus, for example, that's just an example of where you might use the wrong title There are specific titles in the ranks of professorship, so to speak. Anyway, just be careful. Being inaccurate can kill your career. Again, with your quotes, they're suggesting reading back a quote. That kind of gets you into the area where it can be problematic. For example, some people will say, "Oh, let me read the story before you go to press." Oh, no, 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 no. At least not in Western journalism. You would never do that. But I mean, you'd have to really, this has to be such an interview that you have almost no choice but to let them. That's the only way you can possibly get them. For example, let's say you've agreed, and we'll talk about this in just a second, but you've agreed to go off the record. You're not going to say who they are, but they're also concerned about what you say. Well, maybe in that case, you're not going to say who they are anyway, so they'll say it. They're not likely to care about manipulating exactly the words to sound good because you're not using their name. But they have they want to make sure that what you say doesn't identify them and get them killed, for example. And so there are circumstances where I would break my rule and say, that would be one where I would let the person read what I wrote related to his part of the story anyway, and maybe the whole story. If he has an inside perspective, I'd have to be careful with that because even anonymous sources can be manipulative. Over the last 2 years, a lot of anonymous sources have been the sources of stories from the New York Times, the Washington Post, and now we get all done with the Mueller investigation, find out none of those were true. They were being manipulated. Those reporters were being manipulated by people who were in good positions, but they were just plain using the press to try to attack President Trump. So it's you have to be careful, and it can happen both directions, obviously, but you need to be careful of anonymous sources altogether if you think they're going to manipulate you. If it's something really important, like bringing down the President of the United States, then you have people in the bureaucracy that will convince you that they're authoritative and they will bold-faced lie to you. That sort of person, they might try to manipulate exactly what you said in order to gain what they want out of it. Most of the attack on Trump came about because of a former Russian spy named Christopher Steele. And one of the things that just come out in this story about what's happening in America is that they've just gotten some new documents out of the government where Steele went to the FBI, and part of his agreement with the FBI is that he would not talk to anybody else. He would not talk to the press. He would not talk to any other agencies. He'd only talk to them. But then he went to the State Department, and he tried to get them to also get involved in the story. And so first off, and then the State Department emailed or faxed or whatever the FBI and said, your confidential source just came to us trying to sell the story, and we have several problems with his story. And it's important because they used him to get a special warrant that allowed them to wiretap and so forth that they could not have gotten without convincing a judge that this person was that basically that President Trump was dangerous and his associates were dangerous. But also in that affidavit, because this sort of court, what they call a FISA court, does not allow a person to defend himself in that court before they give a warrant. And so they're allowing. So for 2 years they were spying on using different methods, human spies, wiretapping, getting into email and stuff like that against President Trump and some of his associates. And they did it based on this dossier that Christopher Steele created. Well, after 2 years, basically when the head investigator came out, guess what? Nothing from the Steele dossier was quoted as truth. There was nothing that was true. But he was clearly partisan. When he went to the Department of State trying to solicit their help in getting this into the newspapers because he wanted to get it in the newspaper before the election. And he only had a couple of weeks before the election. So he was trying to get them, I think maybe he had a month, but he was trying to get, he was going to newspapers, trying to get them to print it, but they suspected him. So they didn't, only one agreed to print anything at first. They went to the FBI and they were kind of hesitant. So then he went to the State Department. And so what this gal at the State Department emailed or faxed over to the FBI was, first off, this guy broke his agreement with you. Secondly, he's exhibiting a very prejudiced attitude and wanting to get this to the newspaper right now. We have to push this right now. He's trying to put pressure on us to go ahead with something that is not, where he does not have a lot of evidence. And thirdly, some of the stuff he told us is not true. He told us, for example, that people in the Trump organization were getting money from the Russians and they were collecting it from the Miami embassy, the Russian embassy in Miami. There is no Russian embassy in Miami. So he couldn't have been getting money. So his story started falling apart. They sent this stuff to the FBI and they went ahead anyway. So that's what we're getting to now, is now they're investigating the investigators because they were manipulated, and it appears that they became partisan themselves, became part of because nothing that was in the Steele dossier that was a whole investigation was based on turned out to be true. Nothing in it. At least nothing substantial. None of it's in the Mueller report that came out. So anyway, which means that when they went, the critical part of this is that they were supposed to tell the court, the FISA court, whether they had any questions of what they said was true. Any questions. And they said they had no questions. But 10 days earlier, they had gotten this email from the State Department full of questions. And so, again, that's a reason to follow up. So, anyway, you have to be aware that some people are trying to manipulate you, even if they're anonymous. I mean, especially if they're anonymous. They're trying to be anonymous because they know they could go to jail. But they convince you that they're trustworthy. They get you to print it in the newspaper. Journalists hardly ever go to jail in America. But they did a great deal of harm by printing story after story based on lies that people inside the government assured them were true. None of it ended up being true, apparently. At least none of it ended up in the Mueller report. So at least Mueller didn't know it was true. Anyway, again, if you're unsure, it may not be all your quotes, but maybe a part of it. And now, did you say, and then you read back a quote that you're not sure about, that would be fine if it's just a short part. But you need to be real careful, especially people of high status will want to rewrite everything you wrote. If you give them a chance to read your story, they're going to want to change everything. You can't let that happen. So in most cases, you don't permit anybody to read your story ahead of time. Make sure that everything is, it's not just the quote. A quote can be accurate and it can be out of context. And so a true quote can give false information because it's out of context. You get a lot of that with President Trump, by the way. A lot of it is taken out of context. Oh, he said something stupid. Bam, there's the headline. There's a whole story about something stupid he said. And he doesn't help his own case because he tweets and he says stuff he does not use a PR person to help him prepare for the press. So he says things that aren't quite accurate. He says stuff that sounds stupid. He tweets spontaneously. He doesn't let any PR people help him with his public communications. And that's stupid. That is really stupid of him. But no other president would ever do the stuff that Trump does. For a PR person, he's a nightmare, absolute nightmare. But nonetheless, he also has an enemy. The press is typically liberal. He's conservative, and they take him out of context all the time and try to emphasize something that's not that big a deal, but they make it a big deal. So it's what he said they might have it accurate, but it was one sentence out of a long discussion, and they take that out of context, and then they get quotes from somebody. What do you think about this? He said this sentence. And he gets a Democrat congressman to say something bad about it, and they get somebody else to. So suddenly they have a whole story, is basically one sentence out of a long discussion that, yeah, maybe could have been phrased better, but is also just out of context. It was not what he intended to say, but it's now on the front page. Corroboration. So you want to look, if you have any questions, you want to, in some cases, you tell them, how can we corroborate this? How can we support your position here? Because people are going to question whether it's true or not. What are other sources can we talk to, or what documents can we get? What else can we do to corroborate your story so we can make this a stronger story? More people will believe it. Whatever you need to say to get them to help you corroborate. And be careful with unwarranted assumptions. So if they're lying to you, doing your homework is important, preparing ahead of time so that you know, again, like Treaster, you can back them in the corner if necessary, gently, but still back them in the corner with other information you have from other sources. And again, you can this quote here that they're suggesting, your mother tells me your childhood was not an easy one. So now you're using their mother as a source against them. That may, yeah, I guess if you can do it, that's fine. But that's one way. Obviously, if you get their mom involved, it's kind of hard for them to tell you to go to heck or whatever. What you told me doesn't square with what I read in the Wall Street Journal. They're saying thus and thus. So again, a way of kind of backing them up into the corner a little bit. Sources, check their sources. So again, one of the problems with a lot of the stuff in this Trump situation, I was just listening to a top lawyer who worked for the government previously, and she's saying one of the main problems with the Steele dossier was that it had no sourcing. That Steele never gave any of his sources. And so it wasn't just a question of whether he was reliable. It was also a question, were any of his sources reliable? Again, nothing from the Steele dossier ever showed up in the Mueller report. So the FBI was never able to prove anything that Steele put in his dossier. So whether he was himself manipulating, whether somebody was manipulating him, how do you check a source, a secondary source if your main source is not cooperating, is not giving you corroborative information? Now you could be being played for a sucker, and indeed that appears to be the case. That's why the special prosecutor could not come up with anything against Trump, because Steele was himself manipulative. I mean, he was either manipulated or he was manipulative, or both. We don't know. But nothing from the Steele dossier, which it launched the entire investigation, turned out true. They also claimed there were two people they said were Russian agents. It turned out that neither one has gone to jail. They have no proof that those people were Russian agents, so neither one has gone to jail. So everything, their whole case, based on claiming these guys were Russian agents that they could not prove and could not send them to jail, and the Steele dossier, nothing in that was true. And they're, so obviously somebody was manipulating somebody, whether it was Steele and the Democrats trying to manipulate the press and the FBI to go after, try to get rid of Trump, or whether it was the Russians trying to get rid of Trump and feeding them misinformation. We don't know at this point. We don't know. Again, some of the other ways to check something out, again, the corroboration, you can ask your source for corroboration. You can look for other corroboration on your own. You can just think about it yourself. Is this plausible? Think of the hard questions. Again, if Steele comes up with this and claims he has sources in Russia, but he won't name any of the sources, do you automatically trust him? He was a former British spy, which was why they did trust him. But they shouldn't have, apparently. Later on, he was taken to court on a civil suit, in which case he said he had no idea whether the stuff in this dossier was true. It was stuff told to him. So it turned out that he wouldn't even defend his own dossier. And so investigators should have pinned him down better themselves. The timeline, you start, they start telling you these stories. For example, they said that somebody else involved with President Trump had gone to the Ukraine and was getting something from it. I don't remember what he said. It turns out that this person never had gone to the Ukraine. The FBI just had to check. They just had to make one phone call, if they had bothered to find out that this was a lie. He had never been to Ukraine. They could have verified if he went to the Ukraine, when he went to the Ukraine, whether the time sequence made any sense. In this case, the FBI itself fell through, and they did not bother to check what was in the dossier. And other aspects of the dossier that were, like I said, Miami embassy and stuff like that, that if they had bothered to really critically go into this, they could have used these different things and found out there's problems with this story that we're basing our entire which is why the fact that they didn't do it does make the Republicans think that they purposely did not do it. They wanted Trump to be guilty, and they wanted to frame him if necessary, whatever they had to do, because they were not of his party, not of his belief system. Okay, this is the last slide, and very quickly, one of the most important. Some terms you need to be familiar with. Off the record. This means not to be published. It's intended for your background information to enhance the reporter's understanding. So if they say off the record, you can't use it other than to help you look at other places for that information. So it helps you understand the situation, but you can't use this at all in your story until you have other sources. And you need to, if somebody asks you to go off the record, you need to spend some time negotiating and making sure they understand and you understand the details of that agreement, so to speak. If they say off the record, then you say, well, it's okay if we find other sources, right? Because actually, in fact, this mafia reporter said that sometimes they will get you to go off the record specifically so you can't find something out. And so their version of off the record is, no, you can't talk to anybody else either. So in other words, they're trying to stop you from doing the story. They give you some off the record lies, and now they give you no way to corroborate. And so you can't agree to that. You can't agree not to look for other sources. So you need to make sure that that part is clear, that you're going to go ahead with your story and you're going to look for other sources. You won't say anything about them, but you're going to go find other sources to corroborate their story, and you have to be able to use those sources. Now, if you don't clarify that, then they might think that you've stabbed them in the back, that you've lied to them. You said that you were off the record, and suddenly you're running this stuff in the newspaper. But it wasn't, it's because you got it from other sources. So you need to clarify that, and you cannot expect the source to understand these three terms, by the way, or the two terms specifically, the first two. And there's other terms related to it, like anonymous. I need to be anonymous. Well, what does that mean? So you need to negotiate what terms they're using that fall into these categories. Can it be on the record? Can it be published? Can I publish it? Can I go ahead with exactly what you're telling me? That's on the record. Again, off the record, you need it. First off, they may not understand what it means to say off the record. Many reporters, basically, the reporters want to turn it into at least number 2, not for attribution. In other words, that's anonymous. It's anonymous, but it's not off the record. So in this case, you might, you might describe. Sometimes they say somebody in the government in the know. They're very vague about it. Or they say a person, a high-ranking official in the FBI or whatever. They try to get as close as they can, and you have to negotiate that with your source. And it may be necessary that you lie. In some cases, it may not be a high-ranking source in the FBI. It was a high-ranking source in the State Department. But you're trying to establish his credibility without giving him away. So now maybe you got somebody else in trouble over in the State Department. But you're trying to. So in some cases, in this business, you may lie a little bit. If it's a really big story and if you're trying to protect your source, you want to establish a level of credibility from the source without using their name. And so there's a variety of ways of doing it, and you have to negotiate that, because just what can you say? And saying that this person is anonymous source, you have to give them some credibility. Or, I mean, is it a street cleaner? Whether your mother? But you have to give some credibility to the person you're quoting. So you have to give some description of this anonymous source. And of course, even then, like I said, the New York Times and the Washington Post have been doing all sorts of stories that now seem to be false, because somebody, even a high-ranking person, can manipulate you. But you still, in every case, they tried to establish the legitimacy or the credibility of that source. And it turns out that in many cases they weren't credible. But that's a game that's being played by people who understand how to play the game. And people in the government understand that. And especially they can be trained pretty easily to know how to manipulate the press. The press can be very gullible. So off the record means that it's just for background, but then again, the keys, if we can get it corroborated someplace else, we need to go ahead with the story and get them to agree to that, make sure they understand that, and again, negotiate how you identify them, because you have to say something about your anonymous source. You just can't say an anonymous source says this. Well, again, who is that? Your mother, whatever. According to police sources is one sort of phrase you might hear. According to police, so something, just how the more definitive you can be as to suggesting how high they are, then the better, the more credible it is when you say a high-ranking police source says. So you try to give them some credibility if you can. You don't want to lie, but the more credibility you can give them, the better. On the record, of course, is you get to use their name, you get to publish exactly what their quote is, and in most cases that's the case. When we get into areas of off the record and anonymous, not for attribution sort of stuff, those are usually stories that are very hard to get sources on, and they're stories that might get somebody killed or get fired or whatever, bullied, whatever could happen to that person is negative enough that you feel like you have to protect them. And so you agree to let them be anonymous because you're protecting them for whatever reason. And that's the only way you're going to get your story, is if you agree to protect them. So that happens. Okay, any questions? We're out of time. Are we out of questions? Ran over a lot of stuff today. They have I inherited a lot of PowerPoint slides from a prior teacher, and I'm not going through all of them. I'm choosing a few here and there that I think pretty much cover the bases, and this one I think covered a lot of bases. Hopefully, you can learn something from this and apply it in your professional careers. We will, since I'm not using a lot of PowerPoints in this half of the semester, that helps you in the sense that you don't have to review as many PowerPoints. I will review whatever questions there are on the final exam, and I'll make sure it doesn't ask questions based on PowerPoints I didn't use. But like I say, I think they're quite redundant. This one is even somewhat redundant to the last one I did, and there's like 3 PowerPoints in between the last one I used and this one. So there's a lot of redundancy in the PowerPoints that I inherited. And frankly, like I said, the idea of interviewing, there's some really important stuff. I never took a course in interviewing. A lot of journalism programs don't have a specific course in interviewing. It's part of other courses. They might call it reporting, and then in the reporting class they also teach you things about how to get government documents, how to do this and that. So it's not just interviewing. So yeah, I kind of think this should be an advanced reporting class instead of an interviewing class, and then it can be broader and not being as redundant as it is according to the PowerPoints that I inherited, and I don't know how to broaden it either. there's only so much to say about interviewing, frankly. So I think it's you'll get a new, fresh look as Godzilla takes over with broadcasting, and you'll start doing some, some video interviews and stuff like that. And so that will make it a little bit less boring, perhaps, as we change teachers and change perspectives and change media. So uh, I I did not update the attendance sheet with your topics that you are reporting on, but as of the one that I did pass around, there were a lot of empty spots. By now, everybody should have a topic. If you don't have a topic you're reporting on, you're in trouble because we only have a couple more weeks before you're supposed to hand this in. So again, I was going to, my last day was going to be like the 12th or something, and now it's a week later. No, is that right? Now let me look at this. Well, let me see. Is tomorrow the 1st of June? Is that right? So like we have a class next week, like on the 6th and 7th, something like that. I don't have my day timer with me. Well, actually, I think my last day teaching you guys is like the 13th or something, the Thursday of that week, I think. And so then Godzilla takes over like on the 19th or something like that. So basically, you have 2 more weeks to write your story. So if you don't have a topic yet, that's a problem. I mean, you should have had a topic. You should have been interviewing already. So if you haven't, you need to get to work. We talked about this at the start of the semester. We had deadlines. In fact, during the semester I did push it back 1 week because I traded some time with Godzilla. So otherwise it was going to be like the 6th and 7th or something. The 7th would be like the deadline, or I may have said the 10th, but now it's a week later. But that's all it is, 1 week later. So it's whatever day that is, probably the Friday or Saturday. That's I'll give you till the end of that week. So we have maybe like 2 weeks from Saturday will be you can still get it into me. But after that, there'll be penalties. So I haven't given you a lot of homework, right? You haven't had hardly any homework. And so it's not like you've been overworked in the class so far. You have two things you've been working on: your presentation and your story. And you've had the whole half a semester to work on that, basically. So I'm not going to feel real guilty about holding on to this deadline. You need to get going, and if it's after that, there will be penalties applied. So you need to get it done. So I can start grading it. Okay. Any questions? If not, thank you. We're out of time, past time. Thank you.